This is the Shir. The Shir is on Likutei Sichos Chelek Tesvav Parshas Toldos. Toldos base the second Sicha Parshas Toldos. Sicha starts on the pasuk that it says regarding to Yitzchak who faces a rov. There's a famine, and Yitzchak wants to consider doing what his father Avram did, and that is go down to Egypt. So here the Rebbe begins the Sikha on the words that it says Hashem appeared to Avram, to Yitzchak, and he said, don't go down to Egypt. Dwell in this land which I told you, uh, land of Canaan, in which he's in, later to become the land of Israel. Gur Baratz Azois, dwell in this land. The Medrash comments on the words, dwell, Gur Baratz Azois, in this land. That Rav Hoshia said, Hashem was telling him, you are an oila, like a burnt offering, an oila tamima, a wholesome burnt offering, right? Because Yitzchak was offered up on the altar that Avraham was going to bring him at the Akedah, was going to sacrifice him. Last moment, Hashem said not to, but he still is called forever after an oila, that he was a sacrifice, like a burnt sacrifice which was brought in the Beis Hamikdash, just like an oila, a korban, a sacrifice of oila, if it goes outside of the koloim. Koloim means the hangings. In the desert where there was a mishkan, there were hangings that constituted the inner sanctum, not the kodesh hakodashim, but kodesh, not the holy of holies, but holy. Afterwards, in Yerushalayim, that becomes the azara, becomes the main sanctuary, so to speak, of the Beis Hamikdash. So just like in the Beis Hamikdash, when there is a korban oila, burnt offering, if it leaves its the azara, it becomes puzzle, invalidated. Similarly, if you Yitzchak, who has the classification of being like a korban oila, if you leave to Chutz La'aretz, you would become puzzle. So you can't go out of Israel. You're like a sacrifice. Rashi, in his commentary, doesn't comment on the words live in this land, but he comments on the words Al Tered Mitzrayim, don't go down to Egypt. And he explains that Yitzchak was thinking to go down to Egypt, just like his father went down in the days of famine to Egypt. Hashem told him, don't go down to Egypt because you are like an oila tamima, like a korban oila. And chutz la'aretz, outside Israel, is not kedai lecha, is not appropriate for you. So the Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi, learns that Rashi is really saying, same as the Medrash, that since Yitzchak is an oila, and therefore he becomes what is called Kodesh Kodoshim, the kind of sacrifice that's holy of the holy. You see, there are some sacrifices, some korbanos that can be eaten afterwards in the entire city of Yerushalayim. But he is like the holy of holy sacrifices, and therefore, for him, what Hashem is telling him is that the whole Eretz Yisrael is for you, like the Azara is, like the sanctuary and the Beis Hamikdash is for Holy of Holies, for Karbonis that have the status of Kodesh Kodashim. And going to Chutzlars, going outside Israel, would be considered for you like going outside the Azara. And Kodesh Kodashim, these kinds of Karbonis don't go outside the Azara. If they go, they become invalidated, puzzle, they become forbidden forever. So basically, the Pirush of the Ram, Rabbi Eliyahu Mizrahi, is saying, the Rashi is basically saying the same in the Medrash. When you look closely, says the Rabbi, you see that there's a difference between Rashi and the Medrash. And when you look at the differences in the words, you'll also see that there's a difference in the way they're understanding the content of this inyan. What are the differences? Aleph. According to the Medrash, Yitzchak's going out to Chutz La'aretz becomes an invalidation. It's puzzle. If you go to Chutz La'aretz, you're going to be puzzle. Just like a korban oila goes out of its appropriate place, out of the azara, it's invalidated. Rashi doesn't say invalidated. Rashi says chutz la'aretz is not appropriate for you. That's not kedai. It's not worthy. You are of a higher caliber. It's not worthy for you. It's not appropriate for you to be in chutz la'aretz. It doesn't say puzzle. Number two, the Medrash, the way he expounds this concept on the words gur ba'aretz, so just live in this country. Rashi quotes the words, don't go down to Egypt. And on that he says his pirush. These both of these differences, which are hinged one on the other, um, so from both of these differences, which are hinged one on the other, we can understand. And I just hesitated here for a second because in footnote number 5, the Rebbe brings various other midrashim which corroborate what the Rebbe is saying is that these two concepts, what are the two concepts we mentioned? That Rashi says doesn't say possible to leave, and also Rashi goes on the words "don't leave" to Egypt. The Medrash says Yitzchak would be possible if he left. The Medrash also quotes the words and expounds on the words "live in this land." Right. So there's these two differences we find in other midrashim. You can find validation that they're dependent one on the other. The one that brings the word posel about going out of Israel will base his pirush on the words "stay in the land of Israel." But still, for us, this is esoteric. What does this mean? So we understand, says the Rebbe, these two differences is a difference in contents, not just a pedantic play on words here. According to the Medrash, by Yitzchak going out, from the prohibition of going out to Chutz La'aretz is because he has to be in Eretz Yisrael. Because Eretz Yisrael is such a great virtue that for Yitzchak, Eretz Yisrael is like being in the inner sanctum of the Beis Hamikdash. He's an oila and he has to be in the proper holy place. And therefore, if he goes out, he's going to be puzzled because he went out of Eretz Yisrael. We're emphasizing the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, and Yitzchak needs to be in that holiness. If he goes out, oops. However, according to Rashi, when we're saying that Yitzchak shouldn't go out, it's not to do with the special virtue of Eretz Yisrael. Rashi learns that the instruction was don't go to Mitzrayim. There's something negative about leaving, about Chutz La'aretz, that's inappropriate for Yitzchak to be there. Not kedai for you to be there. And therefore, it's connected not with the live here, but it's connected with don't go out to there. Something wrong about there that's not for you. The Medrash is talking about something great about here, that you need to be here. And if you go out, that's it. You're like a fish out of water, so to speak. You're like a carbon out of its appropriate place. So we see a difference here now that Rebbe has pointed out to us between Rashi and the Medrash. Let's further develop this base. According to this, maybe we could. L'cha'ira, it seems we could explain the reason between the difference of Rashi and Medrash. Medrash is seeming to say, live in this land because it's got to do with the holiness of this land. Eretz Israel is holier than all the other lands, so therefore going out of Israel is like a holy carbon oila going out of its holy place of the Azara. And just like a holy carbon oila goes out of the Azara, the kloim, the hangings, Azara, he's going to become invalidated. Yitzchak also, if he goes out of Israel, he loses, he's out of his aura of holiness, where that's where he needs to be. But Rashi, he was al pshat. And in Pshat says the Rebbe here, this is the Rebbe backs this up in the Ha'aris. The Rebbe spoken about this in various other places, but the Rebbe is laying down a foundation here, reminding us that in Pshutei Shemikah, the simple reading of the Torah, the way Rashi learns with a 5-year-old, we don't find that Eretz Yisrael in the time of the forefathers, the time of the Ovis, when it's still called Eretz Canaan, had a special holiness. And that's why Rashi says that not going out of Israel, not going out to Chutz La'aretz, the main issue is not about living here in this country, which the Medrash is founding his drasha on, because this country is holy. No, according to Pshudah Shemikah, there's not a special holiness yet in this country. But there is an unholiness in Chutz La'aretz. It's not kedai to go to Chutz La'aretz. This we will address later. What is the unholiness of Chutz La'aretz? But right now, it's not about Kedushas Haaretz. There's something negative about Chutz La'aretz, positive about Eretz, but it's not hinged on the holiness of Eretz, which we know now that Eretz is holy. It didn't start back then by the Ovis, according to Rashi. However, that would be a possible way to explain why the Medrash and Rashi are learning differently. However, we can't really say like this. Why? But first, let me ask another question. The concept that Yitzchak shouldn't go out of Eretz Yisrael, why does it raise any comment here? We already found it earlier. We had a whole saga and story when Avram sends Eliezer, his servant, to Chutz La'aretz. And he says, I want you to go to my land, take a wife for my son Yitzchak, and Eliezer, and bring her back. And Eliezer asks, maybe the woman won't want to come back to this land. Shall I take your son back to the land where this girl is from, where you are from originally? So Avram says, no, be careful. Don't bring my son back there. And we don't find that there should be anybody that explains And that's because Yitzchak is like an oila, and he can't go out. Why does it become an issue here? Why there is it clear? Avram, why does Avram say you can't go out? So we could explain according to halacha. Why didn't there? Isn't it a question? Because there it's obvious. The din is you're not allowed to go from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz unless to learn Torah to get married. And even then, if you go to learn Torah to get married, you have to go back to Israel once you got married. But to go and live in Israel, you're not allowed to permanently move to Israel to outside Israel, leave Israel for Chutz La'aretz. You're not allowed to permanently do that unless there's such a famine that 1 dinar of chitim of wheat now costs 2 dinar. Things jump by 100% up, then it becomes unaffordable. You have to move to Chutzlar, so then you can be there. So therefore, like this, here's the difference. When in Parshat Chaisar Yitzchak is going, the question is about Eliezer. What's Eliezer's question? If I find him a wife there, shall I take your son to get married there? That means he's going to stay there. He's not going to come back because the whole point is that Eliezer is saying, what happens if the woman doesn't want to come here? And if I take Yitzchak there, well, what's she going to change her mind? She doesn't want to come here. That means we're permanently relocating Yitzchak. You understand why that wasn't a question, why Abraham didn't want to allow that. Because you're not allowed to leave Israel permanently. However, in our parsha, here we're talking about a famine. So therefore, there's no comment. Everybody understands. It's clear. You're not allowed to leave Israel. We know that there's an issue to leave Israel, so can't leave. Because if he goes to a wife that doesn't want to come to this country, he's going to get stuck there. However, in our parsha, we're talking about a famine. No famine, you're allowed to go out. You're allowed to go out and live in Chutz La'aretz. We see that Avram did that, right? Um, and you go for an undetermined time. Points out in the footnote. It's you don't know how long this situation is going to remain a famine. You go, it's a one-way ticket. When things get better, you'll come back. But the going is undetermined for an undetermined amount of time. But there's no issue with that. We see Avram out. So that's why Yitzchak was considering going out of Eretz Yisrael. And here becomes the question: why does Hashem tell Yitzchak not to go? So Hashem had to tell Yitzchak here, even though in the usual order of things, you do go out for a famine to Chutz La'aretz, no issue. Ah, this time don't do it because you're a special case. You are an Eila Tamima. But you can't really, it's difficult to learn like that, says Rabbi. Why? Because the Rambam, when he talks about the halach of not leaving Eretz Yisrael, he says even though you're allowed to go out for a famine, midas chasidus, to go to within the letter of the law, you shouldn't leave Israel, even if there's a famine. We find that the Machlon and Kilian, this is in the book of Rus. I'm not going to go into this story, but Machlon and Kilian were two Gedolah, they were two leaders of the generation, but then they died early. But why did they leave Israel? The whole story of Ruth starts, book of Ruth starts when they leave Israel. They left Israel because of a big trouble. Nonetheless, they died early because since they were such great people, they should have still stayed in Eretz Yisrael and not left. So if we are going to say that the law of going out to Chutz La'aretz, the law of the prohibition of leaving Israel to Chutz La'aretz, was also something that the forefathers did, because we know that the forefathers kept the Torah even though it wasn't given yet. They even ate matzah. They even did things that were rabbinic. So then l'chayra, they should have also been careful not to do things that are within the letter of the law. Especially we find that the Rambam says that these two great people died prematurely because of leaving Israel. So it's a pretty heavy thing. So we'd assume that the Ovis would also fulfill that. So we can't say, therefore, that the reason it's not a question there, that the reason it's um, the reason it's clear, the reason, in other words, we can't say therefore that the reason Yitzchak needs to get a special instruction because he's an Oila is because you're not allowed to leave, is because usually you're allowed to leave Israel for a famine. No, but we're saying now that you're not allowed to leave Israel really, even for a famine, if you're midas chasidus, if you're going within the letter of the law. So you don't have to come with a special instruction to Yitzchak about being an Oila. We understand you're not supposed to leave Israel. But the bigger question is, says the Rebbe, we see that Avraham Avinu did leave Israel, and he went back to Choron. even after the covenant where Hashem promised them Israel, even when there wasn't a famine. So there's something telling us here. Now, what does he mean? The Rebbe quotes a Das Kanim, and this goes, I'll just give you, and the Rebbe says um, that it seems that Rashi also learns the same thing. Here's a little historical snippet, which you don't get necessarily when you read the flow of Parshas Lech Lecha. Later, when the Jews are released from Egypt, there's a pasuk in Bereshis that says that when did the redemption come from Egypt? At the end of 430 years. Now, from the birth of Yitzchak was 400 years. Birth of Yitzchak was already the time that Avram had children, and then what Avram had been told by the covenant is that there'll be 400 years living in a land that's not theirs. That started with the birth of Yitzchak. So we were in Egypt for 210 years, but there was 190 years before that. Started with the birth of Yitzchak, the 400 years. Um, so what's but the pasuk in Shemai says this at the end of 430 years. What's the 30 years? So Rashi there brings that the covenant was 30 years earlier. Now, if you go back, Yitzchak is born when Avraham is 100. Covenant is 30 years earlier. That means Yitzchak is 70. Now, the beginning of Parshas Lech Lecha is that Avraham was 75 and he left. Hashem told him, Lech Lecha, leave your land. But we have a whole story of Avraham being in the land of Canaan and having a covenant with Hashem that he's giving him the land of Eretz Yisrael when Avraham is 70. So really, although it's not written directly, but the Mefarshim explained the Askenim and Rashi, and this is built on a collection of brises called Seder Olam, which is the history of the world. It says that Abraham was 70 and he had left Choram, his ancestral land, his father's place, gone to Eretz Yisrael, and there Hashem had given him the promise, I'm giving you the land of Eretz Yisrael. He had gone back to Choram, probably to take care of his father, and then he got another instruction, leave the land of Choram and go to Canaan. And then already he didn't go back to, even though his father needed taken care of. Once Hashem says, leave, that's it. Then that was a direct instruction that now his service needs to be done in the land of Canaan, even though he's leaving his father behind. So turns out that Abraham has been told he's being given Israel when he's 70 years old, and then he leaves Israel. So if Abraham kept all the Torah, how can he leave Israel? So from this, it's imperative, says the Rebbe, that in the time of the forefathers, it wasn't shaykh, this concept of the prohibition of leaving Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, the prohibition wasn't relevant. And therefore, it wasn't appropriate that the forefathers should need to be careful about it. Even they kept the whole Torah, because the concept of the holiness of Eretz Yisrael, in reference to going out of Israel, didn't apply it. As we understand also from what the Mechilta Medrash says, before Eretz Yisrael was chosen, all the lands were kosher, were appropriate for Hashem to speak in. Once Eretz Yisrael was chosen, then all the other lands left their, were taken out of being places appropriate for Hashem's, for Hashem's, for Hashem to speak to people in. We're saying something that's pretty groundbreaking. That according to Pshut Shomrika, there's no issue of leaving Israel at the time of the office. It doesn't yet have its kedusha. So 1 second. So why doesn't Avraham Avinu want to? Why doesn't Avraham Avinu want to have his son leave? You know why Avraham Avinu doesn't want to have his son leave? So we understand, according to the Pshat, from the words of Avraham himself, that what does Avraham say? I don't want you to leave the land. I want him to stay in the land. Hashem promised me that to your children I'll give this land. Since this is the land that Hashem is giving Yitzchak, Hashem has promised Avraham He's going to give it to Yitzchak. It's inappropriate that Yitzchak, in order to get married, should go away from the place that's going to be his land and go live somewhere else. Hashem has said, I'm giving you this land. You stay here. This is the center of your life. You make sure to find to get married and leave the center of your life here in the land which Hashem has given you. That's why Avraham wants you. However, in our parsha, we're talking about a famine. There's no choice, not about where you're going to set up shop and live. Here's no choice to go. So we would understand that there shouldn't be any issue from temporarily relocating to outside Eretz Yisrael, unless that's why Hashem comes and says, no, 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 you can't leave Yitzchak because you're an oila, you're like a carbon oila. Otherwise, what we're saying is there wouldn't be an issue. Yes, Avram didn't want Yitzchak to make the center of his life somewhere outside of Eretz Yisrael. That's why he can't go there to get married. That's because of the promise that the land will be given to Yitzchak. But that's that's not a reason not to leave during a famine. Why Hashem comes down and says to Yitzchak not to leave during, but by the famine is not because you're not allowed to leave Israel. It's because Yitzchak in particular is not allowed to leave for the purpose. The reason he's an oilam. We'll see if there's no kedusha, why can't he leave? So now the question is, as the Rebbe now asks, if Etzol is not um, different in terms of kedusha, so why can't Yitzchak leave? So we're going to explain this by first explaining another difference between the Lashon of Rashi and Lashon of Medrash. When we talk about the bris, the covenant that was done, it's called the covenant between the pieces. Hashem cut up um, pieces of various living things and um, and, um, and walked between them. Anyway, the bris ben Absarim is called. It says on that day Hashem made a covenant with Avraham to say to your children, I have given this land. So the Medrash says that Hashem, when he says, his speech is deed. And therefore he says, I've given this land to your offspring. It doesn't say I will give. It says I've given. Well, Hashem says it's done. In other words, it's theirs. It already becomes Eretz Yisrael. Rashi, on those words where it says, to your children I've given, he says the saying of Hashem is ki'ilu. It says if it was done. It doesn't say it's done. It says if it's done. Subtle. But according to this comes out a big difference. According to the Medrash, by this covenant was already the act of giving by Hashem. And it became Avram's for him and for all the generations. Whole Eretz Yisrael. And that fits with what the Gemara and the Yerushalmi says, that when it says, to your children I have given, it's not a promise. It's done. It's a done deal. It's already by them. Even before they go into Eretz Yisrael. And this we also say La Halacha. The Gemara says, Eretz Yisrael is yours. It's already a Yerusha from your forefathers. Um, However, according to Rashi, which says, Rashi didn't say it was given, done. It says it's as if it's given. It means it doesn't yet belong to the Jewish people. However, that's enough. The fact that it's as if it's done, that's enough for the pasuk to say, I've given it. Um, it's as if it's done. An interesting thing that Rebbe points out in the footnote, which relates to us every Shabbos, says 6 days you shall do all your work. On the 7th day you rest. Medrash says, can you finish all your work in 6 days? We live many times over 6 days, thank God. No, so it's as if you have to act on Shabbos as if all your work is finished. But the lashon that the Torah uses is 6 days you shall do all your work. If it's as if, the Torah can already use the language, the definitive language. So Rashi, the fact that it says to your children, I have given this land, this fits still, language can be used, and it still can be only, as Rashi interprets, ki'ilu, it's as if it was given. We have to understand. Since according to the Medrash, already the land belongs to Bnei Israel. So why shouldn't we say that it also brings the Kedusha? Right? We find even more than that. The Medrash says elsewhere that from when Hashem created the world, Eretz Yisrael was chosen. So why wouldn't we say that the holiness of the land starts from the time when Hashem made this covenant, and therefore everything about Israel, about Eretz Yisrael and holiness, has to start applying there. Not the obligations to give the tithing and the truma and so on. That is hinged. Hashem said that's hinged on when all the Bnei Yisrael come into Israel. But other things, for example, the fact you're not allowed to leave Israel. So why wouldn't it be if the Medrash is saying that Hashem already gave it? So why wouldn't it already be a holy land, and therefore you're not allowed to leave Israel, and therefore tell Yitzchak don't leave Israel? What's it got to do with him being an oila, right? It should apply to everybody because when Hashem comes to Yitzchak and says you shouldn't leave Israel, we explain Hashem was saying you're an oila, you're a carbon oila. But if what we're saying now, according to the Medrash, where the Medrash says it was already given, why does it apply only to somebody who's Yitzchak, who's an oila? Why does it apply all over? So here the Rebbe says Dalit. We say the explanation of this. We already explained several times. There's a concept that the Rebbe teaches many times: the difference between the mitzvahs that the Avis were Mekayim, that the forefathers kept before Matan Torah, and the mitzvahs that we didn't fulfill after Matan Torah, because the mitzvah before Matan Torah were in a way that we weren't instructed. It's called Einay Mitzvah, not instructed from Hashem, and yet doing it. So while doing a voluntary mitzvah is great, but the mitzvahs that are done without an instruction from Hashem don't have the power to change the essence, the mahus, the essence of the created being that was created through Hashem. Hashem created certain things. There was spiritual worlds and there's physical. Doing a mitzvah means you're injecting and changing the physical to become godly. Can't do that without having a direct instruction from Hashem, without having the power from Hashem, because Hashem created this thing as being material, physical. What happens once Hashem commands us is that the actual physical object becomes a mitzvah. Tefillin become holy. That couldn't be before Hashem gave the command at Matan Torah. That has to be that's a godly power to inject materialism. It's created by Hashem as being separate from holiness. To inject it with holiness, you need Hashem's special power. So what kind of mitzvahs were being done before Matan Torah? It was the fact that the people, the Gavra, as a chefza, the object wasn't changed. You need Hashem's power at Sinai, give you the instruction to allow you to affect that change. But the Gavra, the person, was fulfilling the mitzvah, right? That changed when Hashem gave us the mitzvahs, Matan Torah. The person is now able, Hashem's power, instruct him to do it, to change the actual object in which the mitzvah is being done. And the reason for that is, like the Medrash says, before Matan Torah, there was a great divide. There was a gezerah, there was a decree and a divide. The upper worlds can't come down to the lower worlds. The lower worlds can't ascend to the upper worlds. Physicality, spirituality were with a chasm between them, with a great divide between them. By Matan Torah, Hashem said, "I'm coming down to Har Sinai," and He came down and He elevated the world. And now there can be a joining of heaven and earth, joining of upper and lower. In other words, the Matan Torah instruction Hashem gave at Matan Torah created the concept, the geder, the actual reality, the actual potential reality that something should become an object of mitzvah. And by the same token, an avera and sin. The same way something can become holy, you do, God forbid, if something is Hashem instructs, don't do this, then engaging in that that thing becomes essentially bad. But now the world is impacted by mitzvahs, and it changes the reality of the objects. The preparation for that is once Hashem comes down and gives those instructions, even before the person actuates that, it already becomes everything. All the world has now become appropriate and mukhsha, prepared to be able to be mitzvahized, or God forbid the other, averaized, right? Through the fact that a person later actually fulfills the mitzvah in actuality with the physical. So that's when the Kedusha, the Elyonim, the higher worlds, becomes actually embedded and fixed in the object in the lower worlds. And it becomes an object of Kedusha. Now we can understand also about Eretz Yisrael. Even though the actual ownership of Eretz Yisrael, according to the Medrash, was done at that covenant, but the Kedusha, the actual holiness, that the land itself should be holy, it couldn't be fixed and permanently affected in the object, so to speak, in the actual land. After Matan Torah, even before the Yidden actually moved into Eretz Yisrael and conquered it, But after Matan Torah, now Hashem has made a chidush that there is a possibility, there's a gather, there's a potential and a possibility for this land to actually become holy land by the instruction that Hashem said that the Jews should conquer Eretz Yisrael. Now that land is appropriated and prepared that it's going to be holy. In itself, the actual essence of Eretz will be holy. Before Matan Torah, there was the big divide. Now this can become a reality. And when Yidden did conquer Eretz Yisrael, so that's when the holiness of Eretz Yisrael became attached to the essence, to the actual land. So according to Hey, so that's how we're explaining about the Medrash, that even though the Medrash says Hashem's word is a deed and the land was given, yet in all, nonetheless, it doesn't actually become a reality. The land itself doesn't become able to be holy until Hashem bridges the divide between upper and lower. So now says the Rebbe, according to the way we explain this in the Rambam in the Medrash about the holiness of the land, that will also be the way Rashi looks at about the ownership of the land. Since the way and the gather of the giving of the land from Hashem to the Yidden, it's not just like a regular procedure between somebody who gives and somebody who receives. Usually, when you talk about a transaction, it's a change of ownership. It doesn't change the essence of what's being transferred. It's a transfer of land. And therefore, you can transfer it one way, and that can be uprooted. Somebody can conquer, can go from one person to another. It's not like that with Hashem is giving us the land of Eretz Yisrael. Only Hashem can give the essence, the mahus of the land to the Jewish people, and which removes from it any possibility from it ever belonging to any other nation. It can be conquered, even if it's conquered or somebody takes it over or kicked out, it still is Eretz Yisrael, belongs to us essentially and existentially. So, in other words, the ownership of Eretz Yisrael is also given in a way that its essence is changed. The actual object, in other words, the land of Eretz Yisrael is through Hashem created, made to be Eretz Yisrael. And from then on, no other nation can ever become owners of that. It's essentially bound up in the land. It's Eretz Yisrael. So Mela, that could only be once the Yidden went and actually conquered it. Right? Like we said, Matan Torah creates an ability for the world to be holy, made holy through the fact that Yidden do the thing. Similarly, Eretz Yisrael can only become holy once the Yidden go and conquer it in actuality. And that's when it becomes the fulfillment of what it says. Hashem created the land. With His will, He gave it to the other nations temporarily, and with His will, He gave it to us, giving us the actual essence, etzem mahus, of Eretz Yisrael, because the whole world is His. He created it, so He gives us. He can transfer the actual. Understand what's going on here? It's not a transfer of land which can be transferred here, transferred there. It actually is intrinsically bound up with the Bnei Yisrael. It's given in a way that it's essentially belongs to the Bnei Yisrael. So now we can understand, we can explain the difference between Rashi and Medrash. The fact that an oiler can't go out of the Azara, the Kloim, and if it goes out, it becomes possible. You know what? If you go to the Gemara, it has nothing to do with Kedusha. It does, this prohibition is a prohibition that things are not allowed to go out of their mechitza, of their appropriate place. What is the law? The way it's taught in the Gemara in Cholim and in several places, as the Rabbi says in the footnotes. If the law generally is like this: if an animal is pregnant and there's a fetus in the animal and it's shechted, so the mother becomes kosher, and then the child doesn't require the child can be eaten based on the mother's shechita. It doesn't require a separate shechita. If, however, the fetus stuck out one of its limbs out of the womb, even if it pulled it back in, once it went out of that womb, you're not allowed to eat that limb. That limb becomes forbidden to be eaten. Why? Because the Torah says that meat, basar basada treifa leisechelu, meat which is in the field, having been having been torn, shouldn't be eaten. Basically, that from that the Gemara derives that meat that leaves its usual boundaries, its usual place of being, becomes forbidden. So that tells us that if a fetus sticks out its thing, it has nothing to do with kedusha. The fetus sticks out its limb. Now that limb can't be eaten. This also tells us that when something belongs that in other words, if something has its mechitza, for example, like the fetus, or basar, that the meat that belongs of holies, its place is to be in the azara, or meat that is not holy of holies, but kachim kalim, the lighter form of holiness, which its place needs to be eaten only in Yerushalayim. Both of those meats, when they leave the place they need to be, they become forbidden. Or similarly, the basar of Pesach, Korban Pesach always has to be eaten only with the group that originally formed to bring the Korban Pesach. So it was family, group. You couldn't have the meat of the Korban Pesach being eaten in another group. There were the mechitzas, there was the boundaries where that meat needed to be, and it couldn't leave. So all of these halachas are learned from this concept, right? So therefore, like this, according to the Medrash, when Hashem says, that's done. Eretz Yisrael belongs to the forefathers. Therefore, the moment that Hashem asked for Yitzchak to be offered up, and he becomes like a Korban Eilah, where was he offered up? Here in Eretz Yisrael. That becomes his place, right? That becomes like an Eilah that's in the Hazara. So for him, Chutz La'aretz is out of his mechitza. It's out of the appropriate place that he's been instructed to be in. So it doesn't have to do yet with Kedusha. The Kedusha doesn't start yet. But Eretz Yisrael is it is a land that's already, according to the Medrash, Hashem said he's giving it, he's given it, it's given. So now that's its place. Yitzchak was offered up there, that's your place. You can't leave your mechitza. According to Rashi says, no, that the transaction wasn't yet done because you can only transfer the kind of transferal of Eretz Yisrael that needs to be done requires the bridging of the gap of Matan Torah. So it didn't yet happen. So for him, it's not about Yitzchak needing to be in Eretz Yisrael because that's his place. The place is not yet so. According to the Medrash, right, the place of Eretz Yisrael is totally distinguished now. It's given over to the Jews. According to Rashi, that didn't happen yet. So according to Rashi, why can't Yitzchak leave? So Rashi doesn't say because it's you're like an oila and you're going to be puzzled if you go out. No, because he doesn't hold that Eretz Yisrael is the place for Yitzchak like an oila, because that place hasn't yet become totally given over to Bnei Yisrael. It's only going to happen in Matan Torah. Rashi says over you can't chutzlars is not appropriate for you. What does that mean? Rashi explained the Parsha Yisara that when Avraham said, "Don't take my son back there," what is it based on? As we explained in the Sikha of Chayesara, the second Sikha of Chayesara last week. It says, Avraham told Eliezer, why don't I want you to take back my son to that land? Because he says, Hashem, who's the God of heaven, who took me out of my father's home. And Avraham explained to him, now he's the God of heaven and the God of earth. Because I've made people accustomed to talking about it. When Hashem took me out of the land of my father, he was just Hashem of the heaven, not Hashem of the earth. In other words, people down here weren't familiar with him, and they didn't talk about him in their earthly existence. So as the Rebbe explained on that, that's why that was Abraham's explanation to Eliezer why I don't want you, why Chutz La'aretz, and the place where I come from is not good to take my son to. Because there Hashem is only like Elikei Hashamayim. Hashem is only recognized as the God of heavens, not Elikei, it's not the God of earth. Because there they don't have any conception of Hashem. And as we explained, that the Rebbe says, Avraham explained that even food down here on earth comes from Hashem. Don't say thank you to me, the host. Say thank you to the one who provides it. Really, Hashem. So, but that's something I've achieved here, says Avraham, not there where I come from. So don't take my son there. Eretz Yisrael, there Hashem is also Lekei Haaretz, because Avraham Avinu has done a lot of work in Eretz Yisrael. I've made Hashem's name, says Avraham, familiar in the mouth of people. However, It's not yet totally transformed. It's only I've made the people accustomed in their mouth to talk about Hashem. Their essence hasn't changed, right? And Nishkin Shine Mehus in the Brias in Zeir Hanogas, and therefore their deeds and their behavior hasn't hasn't changed internally. They now have a familiarity. They talk about Hashem, but it's not like they're totally transformed. So please, I can't take a wife from here. Take a wife for Yitzchak from there, where the people are of a different caliber. They're from my family. Now we can understand that when we talk about the Mila of Yitzchak, who was an Oila Tmima, he was like a carbon Oila. So even though it's not according to Pshut Shemikah that he has to be in Eretz Yisrael because of some great virtue of Eretz Yisrael, we said that Eretz Yisrael still wasn't given over, that you needed Matan Torah for Eretz Yisrael to transform. According to Pshut Shemikah, simple reading of the Pshut, there's no prohibition to leave. However, the fact is that this is a place. Chutz La'aretz is not appropriate because there it's still a lekei haaretz. Even the name Hashem is not talked about with familiarity in Chutz La'aretz. So therefore, don't go there. So now we have a beautiful wrap up here. The Medrash says on the words "live in this land." Hashem is telling Yitzchak, "You're an oila. You can't. This land is where you have to be." Rashi says, "Don't go there." He says his pshat "Don't go there" because Chutz La'aretz is not good for you. Because now we see clearly, according to the Medrash, Eretz Yisrael is already given, it's transacted. It comes, Hashem says, it already belongs to Eretz Yisrael. And that creates a mechitza, even though there's still no kedusha, but it creates a place. And that place is where Yitzchak was a carbon. And we know there's a rule that when something has its place of holiness, it shouldn't leave the place of holiness. So be here, this is your place. Rashi is saying, no, the reason Hashem said don't leave Israel is because you're a person of holiness, and it's inappropriate to go to a place where they don't behave holiness. By the way, there's so many footnotes here, beautiful things. One of the things that points out here is lahoy to point out. This is in the middle of footnote 68 to point out just that one of the reasons of not there's a prohibition of leaving Eretz Yisrael after the Bnei Yisrael conquered and so on. One of the reasons of not leaving Eretz Yisrael is because of the God fearingness there. And we find also the Gemara Ksubis that when the Bnei Yisrael lived in Bavel, when they were there in exile, you're not allowed to leave Bavel. Why couldn't you leave Bavel? Because there were, or um, because there was Chachma and Yiras Chet. Um, I won't go into that prohibition, but the concept is that Bavel was a place of, like Rashi says, the yeshivas and Torah and so on. It was also a place of God fearingness. So there was an instruction also not to leave Bavel, Babylon. At any rate, so the point being that now we understand why, according to Rashi, Yitzchak couldn't leave because it's inappropriate. The holiness outside of Eretz Yisrael, the holy behavior is not the same outside Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael, that's the place where Abraham has created an aura and an atmosphere and so on. Well, there are huge amounts of artist footnotes here. Beautiful discussion about because I'm sure you'll have questions. We know that Yaakov was scared to leave Egypt. We know that it seems to be, as you read the Torah, also that there's a specialty in Eretz Yisrael. So there's a lot of reconciling and a lot of back and forth about the um, the specialty of Eretz Yisrael on the one hand during the time of the Avos, on the other hand, where the Rebbe is explaining to us very clearly here that the concept of Eretz Yisrael, Pshut Mikra, that Eretz Yisrael becomes Kodesh, becomes holy, yet from the time of the Avos, is not the premise of Pshut Mikra. Yet, clearly, the atmosphere of Eretz Yisrael, because of what Avraham has created, is a holy atmosphere, and therefore, For Yitzchak particularly, who's an Eilat was such an holy individual who's brought up as a sacrifice, for Yitzchak, it's inappropriate to leave Eretz Yisrael, just like it was inappropriate that he should go out for the Shidduch. And exactly the reason Avraham explained to Eliezer there, based on the way that Rebbe learned in the Rashi, here people talk about Hashem as being a reality in earth. There, outside, no, they don't. So you shouldn't go there. Zayin. A, we can explain this difference between the two opinions in the Pnimius. According to the Medrash and Halacha, the ownership of the Yidden of Yisrael was also started from the time of the forefathers. And that's why Yitzchak was not allowed to go outside Yisrael. He was an Eilah. According to Rashi, there wasn't any ownership in actuality. That started when the Bnei Yisrael went into when the Jewish people conquered and went into Yisrael. So why can't you leave? Why can't Yitzchak go to Chutzah? It's inappropriate. How does this play out? What did I say like this? It's not the Medrash. Medrash is higher than Pshat. In other words, it's higher than the way things are in the simple thing. It's it's got to do with the spirituality of things. There's the simplicity of things, which is what we see, the physicality, and then there's the spirituality of things. Medrash is higher than Pshat, so I'm saying it's higher than the simple. It's talking about this more the spiritual, which of course also has its effect on the physical world. It's not esoteric and unrelated. The spiritual, the way it affects the physical. So in the spiritual side, the ownership of the Yisrael by the Jews becomes through the speech of Hashem, which is a deed. And that already is relevant and creates the ownership of Bnei Yisrael on, on Eretz Yisrael. However, according to Rashi, who's Pshutish make the simple reading, what you have to look at is the world of Pshat, the way things look on the surface, in the world of deed, in actuality, in this world. Therefore, the ownership of Yidden on Eretz Yisrael also needed to be effectuated in reality. The Jewish people come and conquer Eretz Yisrael. However, through what happens through this physical conquering of Eretz Yisrael, the essence, the mahus of Eretz Yisrael, of the land, becomes transformed. And what comes revealed is what Hashem does in Bris Bein Absarim. What comes revealed is that Hashem has given over the actual essence of the land, that the land has become Eretz Yisrael and a holy land in a way that's forever, as explained before. Thank you.